Bitter winter wind howled through the darkened landscape, carrying a fresh layer of snow that blanketed the quiet countryside. In the middle of the storm, a lone Mustang struggled forward, its powerful legs faltering beneath the relentless weight of exhaustion. Its once majestic coat was damp with melting snow, revealing ribs that jutted through its thin frame. Each breath was labored, clouds of mist rising in the freezing air. The wild horse had no more strength left, yet something deeper, something instinctive, drove it forward. There was no herd to return to, no safety in the wilderness. It had only one option, to trust the only warmth it could find. Miles away, nestled within a thick grove of evergreens, Luke Miller sat alone inside his cabin, absently running a hand through his scruffy beard as he listened to the fire crackle in the hearth. The warmth of the flames cast flickering shadows across the wooden walls, filling the space with a comfort that had long since become routine. Luke had chosen this life years ago, preferring solitude over the chaos of the outside world. His days were simple: chopping wood, hunting for food, repairing the small cabin that had become his sanctuary. He liked it that way. The isolation gave him a sense of control, a reprieve from the noise of a past he no longer wished to recall. But tonight something felt different. A strange unease settled in his chest as he stared into the fire. Riley, his aging border collie, lifted her head from the rug beside him, ears perked. A second later, a soft thump sounded against the wooden door. Luke frowned. No one ever came this far into the wilderness. His nearest neighbor was a good 10 miles away, and he wasn't expecting company. Standing, he grabbed his rifle, just in case, and moved toward the entrance. The moment he opened the door, the storm slammed against him, a gust of frigid air nearly stealing his breath. But what shocked him wasn't the cold, it was the sight before him. A wild Mustang stood trembling at his doorstep, snow clinging to its matted coat, eyes wide with desperation. Luke's pulse quickened. This wasn't normal. Wild horses didn't approach humans, much less seek shelter. His gaze traveled lower, and that's when he saw it, a deep, jagged wound running along the animal's side, half hidden beneath its tangled mane. Blood, dark and frozen, clung to the fur around it. Instinct took over. Luke stepped aside, his voice barely above the wind. "Come on," he murmured, not expecting the Mustang to obey. But to his surprise, the horse hesitated only for a moment before stumbling inside. It was a movement of pure trust, unearned, unspoken. As soon as the door shut behind them, the Mustang collapsed, legs folding beneath its weakened body. Riley, still on edge, sniffed cautiously before circling back to her spot by the fire. Luke wasted no time. He moved quickly, grabbing an old blanket from the couch and draping it over the shivering animal. Up close, he could see just how bad its condition was. Its ribs protruded sharply, its breathing ragged. Whatever had happened, the Mustang had been struggling for days. It was a miracle it had even made it to his doorstep. Sinking to one knee, Luke placed a steady hand against the horse's side, feeling the rapid rise and fall of its chest. "You're safe now," he said softly, unsure if the animal could even hear him. The Mustang's ears twitched, but it didn't move away. It was as if it had finally found a place to rest, a fleeting moment of peace in a world that had nearly destroyed it. Luke knew what came next wouldn't be easy. He had no experience caring for a horse, wild or otherwise, but something inside him refused to turn away. He had spent years keeping the world at a distance, living by his own rules. But now, as he looked into the Mustang's weary eyes, he realized something undeniable. This wasn't just a horse that needed saving. This was a turning point, one that neither of them had expected. The fire crackled softly, its warmth slowly pushing away the chill that had clung to the Mustang's trembling frame. Luke knelt beside the wild horse, his brow furrowed as he took in the extent of its injuries. The gash along its side was deep but not fresh. Whatever had caused it had happened days ago, maybe longer. Infection was a real threat, and Luke had no medical supplies meant for horses. He could clean the wound, maybe bandage it, but beyond that, he wasn't sure what else to do. The Mustang exhaled heavily, its breath fogging in the cabin's dim light. Its dark eyes flicked toward him, still wary but not frightened. That, more than anything, unnerved Luke. A wild horse should have bolted the moment a human got too close. Yet, here it was, trusting him, seeking him out. Riley, still watching from her spot by the fire, let out a quiet whine. Luke glanced at her, as if expecting an answer, but the dog only laid her head back down, her tail flicking uncertainly. He turned his attention back to the Mustang. "All right," he muttered, standing up. "Let's see what we can do." Moving quickly, he retrieved his first aid kit from the cabinet. It wasn't much, some antiseptic, gauze, a roll of bandages. He poured a generous amount of antiseptic onto a clean cloth, then hesitated. The Mustang hadn't fought him yet, but this was going to sting. Bad. "Easy," he murmured, placing a firm but gentle hand on the animal's neck. The moment the cloth touched the wound, the Mustang flinched hard, letting out a sharp, pained huff. Its muscles tensed, and for a second, Luke thought it might kick out. But instead of bolting, the horse stilled, its ears flicking back as if bracing itself. Luke let out a slow breath. "You're tougher than you look." He worked quickly, dabbing the wound with careful precision. The horse twitched now and then but made no attempt to fight him off. That fact alone sent a shiver down Luke's spine. This Mustang had been through something bad. Most animals would have fought, but this one, it had already accepted the pain. By the time he finished, his hands were stained with antiseptic and dried blood. The wound was clean, wrapped securely in gauze, but it was still a long way from healing. Luke sat back on his heels, studying the horse. It had relaxed slightly, its body no longer shaking as violently. It was exhausted beyond measure, but at least it was out of the storm. He ran a hand down his face. "What happened to you?" The Mustang didn't answer, of course, but the silence between them felt charged, as if the animal somehow understood the weight of his words. Luke pushed himself up, heading to the kitchen. He had some old oats in the pantry, nothing fancy, but better than nothing. He poured them into a shallow dish and set it near the horse, then grabbed a small bucket of water. The Mustang lifted its head, nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. It hesitated, then slowly nudged the food with its muzzle. After a few beats, it took a tentative bite. Luke let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Good," he murmured. "You need to eat." The horse chewed slowly, its movement sluggish but steady. It was weak, but it was trying. Luke leaned back against the counter, watching in silence. He had seen plenty of injured animals in his time. Wounded deer, lost wolves, even the occasional bear cub in trouble. But this was different. This horse wasn't just surviving. It had chosen to come here. Luke wasn't a man who believed in fate, but something about this didn't sit right. Wild horses didn't seek out humans, not unless they had nowhere else to go, not unless they were desperate. Riley let out another soft whine, shifting her weight before finally standing. She took slow, measured steps toward the Mustang, stopping just a foot away. The horse lifted its head, ears pricking forward. For a moment, neither animal moved. Then, to Luke's surprise, Riley slowly sat down, tail flicking in quiet curiosity. The Mustang didn't flinch away, didn't react with fear or aggression. Instead, it simply exhaled, lowering its head once more. Luke felt something settle in his chest. Whatever had happened to this Mustang, it had been running from something, and somehow it had ended up here. He glanced toward the window, the storm still raging outside. The wind howled through the trees, rattling against the cabin's wooden frame. Whatever was out there, whatever had left this horse in this condition, it wasn't finished. Luke didn't know why, but a part of him told him that this Mustang hadn't just stumbled upon his cabin by chance, and that thought alone sent a chill down his spine. He had spent years keeping the world at arm's length, living in solitude, far from the chaos of people and their troubles. But as he looked at the Mustang, its ribs still visible beneath its thin coat, its eyes holding a quiet intelligence that unsettled him, he realized something. He wasn't alone anymore. And whether he liked it or not, this horse was now his responsibility. The fire burned low in the hearth, filling the cabin with a warm, flickering glow. Luke sat on the floor, back resting against the wooden wall, his eyes fixed on the Mustang as it dozed fitfully. Every few minutes, its ears would flick at some distant sound, its muscles tensing before relaxing again. Even in sleep, it didn't seem to fully let its guard down. That alone told Luke more than he needed to know. This Mustang had spent too long looking over its shoulder. Riley had finally settled too, curled up near the Mustang's front legs, her head resting on her paws. It was rare for her to trust an animal so quickly. Luke had seen her chase off wild elk without a second thought, but with this horse, she had chosen to stay close. Luke let out a slow breath, glancing back toward the window. The storm hadn't let up. If anything, it was worse now. Snow slammed against the glass, the wind wailing like a living thing. He had seen bad storms before, but something about this one felt different, unrelenting, almost unnatural. His gaze drifted back to the Mustang, his mind turning over the same question that had been nagging him all night. Where did you come from? Wild horses roamed these parts, but not this close to the valley. They stuck to the higher ground, keeping away from humans and roads. This one, though, had appeared at his doorstep as if it had been seeking him out. Luke shifted forward, watching the slow rise and fall of the Mustang's ribs. It was still too thin, its body still weak. The wound along its side was healing, but the deeper wounds, whatever had made this animal so guarded, so desperate, those would take much longer. Rubbing a hand down his face, Luke pushed himself up. He moved carefully, making sure not to startle the Mustang, and grabbed a thick blanket from the couch. Without a word, he draped it gently over the horse's back. The Mustang flinched at first, but didn't move away. That was progress. He sighed, rubbing at the tightness in his chest. He hadn't signed up for this. A quiet life, that was what he had wanted. No complications, no responsibilities beyond what was necessary. He had come out here to be alone. So why couldn't he bring himself to ignore the way the Mustang had looked at him? Luke stepped back, stretching his arms over his head before walking toward the kitchen. He needed coffee. Something to keep his mind from circling the same thoughts over and over. As he poured himself a cup, a noise outside made him pause. It was faint, almost imperceptible over the howling wind, but distinct enough to put him on edge. A sound that didn't belong in the middle of a storm. A distant whinny. Luke's grip on the mug tightened. Slowly, he set it down and moved toward the door. His boots were silent against the floor as he reached for his rifle, his instincts kicking in before he could stop them. He wasn't paranoid, but years of living out here had taught him to trust his gut. Something was out there. He cracked the door open just enough to peer outside. The cold hit him like a punch, the wind immediately pushing against the door as if trying to force its way inside. Snow whirled in chaotic patterns, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. Then he saw it. Tracks. Fresh ones. His pulse kicked up a notch. The prints weren't from an animal. They were too deep, too deliberate. Someone had been out here, recently. A bad feeling settled in his stomach. Luke scanned the storm, searching for movement, but the snow was too thick. Whoever had been here was gone now, or they were still watching. His fingers flexed around the door handle before he shut it firmly, locking it behind him. He turned back to the Mustang. The horse was watching him. Its ears were pricked forward, eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made his chest tighten. It wasn't fear, it wasn't even curiosity. It was recognition. Luke's jaw clenched. Whatever this horse had been running from, it hadn't escaped it yet. A shiver crawled down his spine, and not from the cold. He wasn't alone out here anymore, and neither was the Mustang. Luke's pulse pounded in his ears as he stood motionless in the cabin, his eyes locked on the Mustang. The horse hadn't moved, but the look in its eyes told him everything. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just the storm. Riley let out a low growl, her ears pinned back. She sensed it too. Luke exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think. He had spent years living in the wilderness, years reading tracks, understanding the way the land spoke if you knew how to listen. Those footprints outside weren't random. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching. His eyes flicked to the rifle leaning against the door frame. The storm made it impossible to see anything beyond the swirling whiteout, but his instincts screamed that this wasn't just bad weather. He glanced at the Mustang again, taking in its tense posture, the slight tremor running through its frame. This horse had been running from something. Luke had assumed it was the cold, starvation, or maybe an attack by another animal. But now he wasn't so sure. "Who's out there?" he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Riley's growl deepened. A gust of wind slammed against the cabin walls, rattling the window panes. Luke tightened his jaw. He needed to know what he was dealing with. He strode across the room, grabbing his coat and pulling it over his shoulders. As he reached for the rifle, the Mustang suddenly whinnied, a sharp, desperate sound. Luke froze. The horse had barely made a sound all night, but now it was staring at him, its nostrils flaring, its muscles coiled tight like a spring ready to snap. It didn't want him to go outside. Luke hesitated. He wasn't one to let fear dictate his actions, but something about the Mustang's reaction sent an uneasy chill through him. Still, he couldn't just sit here. He needed to know what was lurking beyond those trees. He stepped toward the door, another whinny, louder this time. Then, from outside, came the sound of movement. Crunching snow. Luke's breath stalled in his chest. Not the wind, not an animal. Footsteps. His grip tightened on the rifle. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end as he carefully unlatched the door, inching it open just enough to peer into the blizzard. Nothing. Only the thick veil of white swirling violently in the wind. He was about to close the door when... a shadow. It moved just beyond the trees. Tall. Human. His muscles tensed, adrenaline flooding his veins. Luke stepped back, shutting the door with a quiet click. He pressed his back against it, rifle in hand, his mind racing. Whoever that was, they weren't lost hikers. No one traveled in a storm like this unless they had a reason. Riley let out a sharp bark, her body rigid. The Mustang stomped a hoof. Luke swallowed hard. Something wasn't right. Then, a knock. Software deliberate. Luke's heart slammed against his ribs. No words, no calls for help, just knocking. Slow. Rhythmic. Like whoever was outside knew exactly what they were doing. He didn't answer. The knock came again, and then silence. Luke held his breath, listening. The wind howled, then a third knock, slow, purposeful. His blood ran cold. This wasn't random. Whoever was outside wasn't lost. They had come for a reason. And somehow, Luke knew. It had something to do with the Mustang. The silence that followed the third knock was suffocating. Luke stood frozen, his grip tightening around the rifle. His breath came slow and steady, his senses honed on the space beyond the door. The only sounds were the wind rattling against the cabin walls and the low, anxious breathing of the Mustang behind him. Then, footsteps. Soft but deliberate, crunching over the snow, moving away. Luke waited, muscles coiled, heart hammering. Seconds stretched into minutes. Finally, he took a slow step toward the window, careful not to make a sound. He pulled back the curtain just enough to see through the frost-covered glass. Nothing. Whoever had been there was gone. But where? The wind howled, whipping snow into spirals that danced in the moonlight. Luke scanned the tree line, searching for movement, a flicker of shadow, anything. But the storm had swallowed them whole. Behind him, the Mustang let out a deep, uneasy breath. Luke exhaled, lowering the rifle. He knew better than to think this was over. Whoever that was, they'd be back. Dawn broke in slow, muted grays, the remnants of the storm clinging to the landscape like ghosts. Luke barely slept, his mind replaying every sound, every moment from the night before. The Mustang, still weak but recovering, had stayed close, watching him with knowing eyes. He stepped outside, Riley at his side, her nose twitching as she sniffed the fresh snow. The tracks were still there, deep, methodical prints leading away from the cabin. He crouched, tracing the edges with his fingers. They weren't hurried. Whoever it was hadn't been in a rush. They wanted him to know they'd been here. Luke followed the tracks into the forest, each step deliberate, his body on high alert. Riley moved ahead, her ears pinned forward. The Mustang had stayed behind, but he could still feel its presence, as if the horse's energy lingered with him. The tracks wove through the trees, leading deeper into the woods. Luke's instincts screamed at him. This wasn't just some lost traveler. This was a path meant to be found. Then he saw it. The tracks stopped. Dead in the middle of the clearing. No signs of struggle, no new footprints leading away. Just nothing. Luke's pulse quickened. He scanned the area, but the forest was still. It was as if whoever had stood here had simply vanished. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A mark. Not just any mark, the symbol. It was carved into the bark of an ancient tree, identical to the one on the rock. Luke stepped closer, his fingers grazing over the rough grooves. The same intricate design, sharp angles, deliberate lines. This wasn't just a coincidence. Whoever had been watching him knew about the Mustang. They knew about the symbol. And now, they knew about him. Luke returned to the cabin, his mind a storm of its own. As he entered, the Mustang lifted its head, ears forward, eyes locked onto his. "You knew," Luke murmured. The horse didn't move, didn't react, but deep inside, Luke felt it, that silent understanding between them. This wasn't just an injured animal seeking shelter. This was fate. The Mustang had led him to something bigger than himself, something ancient and powerful. And whoever had come to his door in the dead of night, they knew it too. Luke ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. The storm outside had passed, but something told him the real storm was just beginning. If this story left you on the edge of your seat, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping tales of fate, survival, and the unbreakable bonds between man and nature. What do you think the symbol means? Who do you think was watching Luke and the Mustang? Share your theories below. The journey is far from over. Don't miss what happens next.